Anyway, we are in Philippians. We're still in chapter 1. Might be able to finish it up today. It's the last half. I found out in studying this before, and I found out again looking back over the notes. It's like everything Paul writes throughout this little letter, every paragraph can be a lesson, a sermon. It's condensed dynamite is what it's like. And it's just very useful information. I don't like to speed over it. I have been accused before of taking too much time on certain areas. But where I was in Roseville, and I appreciate Steve's comments a couple weeks ago, they told me, don't hurry. Take your time. We want to digest it. And these letters, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and the little tiny letter of Philemon, you can't hurry through. Just because of having to understand the time period, what was going on with the church as a whole, but then, as Paul says, what his personal experiences were. You have to know all of that in order to get the true meaning behind what's going on. I mean, you can get the meaning by reading through it quickly. And I encourage you to do that. Every year, I used to read it to Kathy when she was sick because she couldn't see well enough to read. So we'd read, and that was one thing we did. And every year, it's amazing what you can learn just reading through. You always learn something new. And these little letters, no exception. So it's a good study. I enjoy it very much. If anybody needs a handout, I passed them out a couple weeks ago. If you still need one, raise your hand. I got it. It says Paul's update, chapter 1, verses 12 through 30 at the top. Okay. It's a very good question you asked a couple weeks ago about how many imprisonments Paul had. By reading the scriptures, you would think there was just one. But according to good traditional history, there were at least 3 lengthy imprisonments. There were other ones, like the one in Philippi, which was overnight. You remember they were singing hymns, and there was an earthquake, and the proconsul and all the officials realized they had just whipped a Roman citizen without a trial. And so they said, okay, you guys can leave. Oh, no. You guys escort us out of town. You make your apology as public as you made your accusations. And so that's how the church in Philippi began with that sort of thing, was with Paul in prison. And so there was an imprisonment where he was arrested in the temple because they thought he had brought a Gentile into the temple. That was just an accusation. You know how a lot of things in history, they claim this is what started it. And that's not what started it. That was just their way of getting people. The Crusades through the British Empire. The Crusades were not to win back the Holy Land for Christians from the Muslims. It was an excuse to, despoil as much as they could, land grab. Sometimes some people did do it for that reason. That became, you have to have a cause that's big enough to cause someone to give their life for it. And so they claimed it was to win back the Holy Land. But most of the soldiers who fought, who agreed, volunteered to do it, went over there for the loot of money. If you watch the movie, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, Prince John had hired these mercenaries, and the way that Robin and his men got them to turn away from it was to dump out these treasure chests they had been robbing everybody from. And of course, all the mercenaries stopped what they were doing and picking it all up. That's pretty much, how those things tended to go. So, Paul's imprisonments. He was arrested in Caesarea. It wasn't true that Titus was with him. They just saw that Titus was with him in the city and assumed Paul had brought, and they were going to tear him limb from limb, if you remember the story in the book of Acts. And the soldiers were there at his rescue immediately. And that's because there was a Roman barracks built right into the temple precinct. Herod did that. They had their Roman garrisons in the neighborhoods that were the most likely to misbehave. And so for the temple to have a Roman barracks built right into the temple site showed you that was a hotbed of violence. And so the soldiers were there. He was transported to Caesarea at the time and then on to Rome. He was promised he would make his defense in Rome before he even arrived back in the Holy Land. So he knew at the time that nothing bad was going to happen to him there. And that he had a Roman escort to Caesarea because there were guys who had promised to kill him. They weren't going to eat or drink until they had killed him. So they were very hungry, very thirsty guys because the Roman soldiers surrounded him and escorted him all the way to Caesarea and then got on a Roman ship, a Roman troop ship bound for Rome. That was the first imprisonment. The second one, I think, is where this has taken place here. He was arrested. Again, it was the accusations of the Jews and a lot of the turmoil that had come around. You know what they accused the Christians of? To get the Romans against them? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It had something to do with Lord's Supper.
Something to do with what?
The Lord's Supper.
Eating real flesh.
Eating a body and drinking the blood. And of course, you know, go to the tomb where he was buried, and there's no body there. Somebody took the body. They're doing something with it. Cannibalism.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's what they were accused of. And so the Romans, of course, hated that. And so they persecuted the Christians. Not for long, because it didn't take them long to realize that the Jews were just trumping up the charges. They realized after the trials that it was just a symbolic gesture. And we were just making Jesus a part of our life. The bread just represented, and it was just bread, and it was just fruit of the vine. So Paul did make his defense, and he was released according to very influential histories of the early church. He at that time then, let's see if I can do this backwards, from Rome, according to very acceptable tradition, went to the edge of what they thought was the land mass on earth. He went over to Spain. That was his purpose. And when he wrote Romans, he said, that's what I want to do. I want to go to Spain. I want to go to the ends of the earth. According to this tradition, he made it. And he was on his way back with another gift, collection gift, to the people, to the Christians in Judea, when he was rearrested because the Jews had caused another stir and had claimed that it was the Christians who burned Rome under Nero. Paul then, as one of the supreme leaders of this sect of Judaism, the violent sect, as the rabbinical schools had trumped it up to be, he was rearrested at that time, and that was not a very comfortable imprisonment, and that's when he wrote his last letters, last being to Timothy and Titus. 2 Timothy, probably his last. He knew the end was coming. He knew he was not going to escape the charges this time. He'd been arrested too many times. He was a firebrand. He was a lightning rod. And the Romans hated anything that incited riots or insurrection. That's how the Jews got Jesus crucified. Remember when they brought him to Herod? Herod didn't want anything to do with it. Just take him yourself and punish him the way you want. Well, we can't crucify anybody without your permission. Who said anything about crucify? You want me to crucify your God? And they accused him of insurrection, leading an insurrection. And so the Romans then were handcuffed, hand-tied, to put Jesus to death by crucifixion because Herod, he was going to release him, but he saw a riot starting. And the religious leaders had stirred up that. They had hand-selected the people for that crowd. And in order to avoid an insurrection or a riot, he goes over and he washes his hands and said, do what you want. That's how they got Jesus crucified. That's how they had most of the disciples, most of the apostles, martyred, including Paul. And it is by tradition that he was beheaded for the faith, for being a leader of a violent sect under Nero, the emperor. So, knowing all of that kind of gives you the time period of where he is. He's in this middle imprisonment that we know of. He is sure that in standing trial he can show, I'm not a violent person, and that they will release him. And that, according to what New Testament, early century histories did prove that was the case. So Paul is writing this letter to the church in Philippi, and he has a good idea that he is going to be released. And that is one thing he says in the letter. He says, I hope soon to be able to come and visit you. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, because when he went to Spain, it was on his way back when he was rearrested, according to the traditions that you can read. Okay. Here in chapter 1, Paul is just giving them the information about what's going on. This is a letter written to a congregation who has sent support to him. Their messenger fell ill, and whether that meant he had disease, which very likely because of the prison conditions of the prisons at the time, or unless he was arrested and thrown into prison and was beaten and wasn't doing well. Whatever the case, Epaphroditus, the guy who had sent the letter, or who had brought the aid, and the letter was going back to the city of Philippi to let them know that his condition has improved. And he's just filling them in on what's going on. He wants to encourage them. You don't need any discouragement. We got plenty of that, don't we? In order to keep this kind of a cause going, you have to give encouragement constantly. And that was the purpose the early church met together. They met together to have positive input, because you're not going to get it outside of here, outside of our fellowship. They didn't necessarily come together to take the Lord's Supper. They did that as a fellowship encouragement. They didn't meet together because it was required. They met together because, like eating, you can't live without it. You need the encouragement. You need the building up. You need a place of refuge for when you failed. And so you have some people you feel comfortable with, knowing they'll forgive you and give you another chance. And that's what the church was designed for. That's what Paul is trying to do here with this congregation. All right, this verses 12 through 30 just talk about Paul's condition. I think we made it halfway down before. How does Paul feel about his confinement? It actually turned out to be a good thing, he said. I'm not sure too many people even today would say, huh? How could that be a good thing? What two things worked out?
He could preach to the guards and to all the other prisoners.
Okay. All right. My being in prison here, I'm not being silent about why I'm here. I'm taking every advantage. Yeah, I'm going to go to Rome and talk to Caesar. It hasn't happened yet. No one can tell me I can't. It was like one commentator had said, you could. It was my professor in grad school. You could lock him up, but you couldn't shut him up. Yeah. He took every advantage he could to preach the gospel to whoever was there. He didn't care if they listened or not. Remember Jesus' parable of the sower? You throw the seed everywhere and let the soil decide what they're going to do with it.
Miranda wouldn't have done any good, would it?
No.
Had the right remaining silent?
No.
Nope.
No need to be silent. You're right.
He had a captive audience also.
Yeah, those poor guards. I still laugh to myself when I think about it, when they get there and realize it's my turn to guard Paul. Oh, man. I'll pay you $100 if you want to do it today. Yeah, you can imagine. However, there is, okay, let's take a little bit of a diversion before we get back here to the last chapter of the book of Acts. And this is actually what some believe was, was either the end of Luke's ministry or he just wrapped it up and didn't have any more to write after this. It's very possible Luke got caught up with the martyrdom too. We don't know how old Luke was. He was a doctor. He was a traveling physician. But he finishes with Paul apparently during this imprisonment. Apparently. It really never really does say which one it was. He talks about one shipwreck in Acts chapter 27, and yet when Paul talks about the things he's gone through, he talked about 3 shipwrecks. So he talked about multiple stonings and being left for dead. So a lot of things happened that Luke didn't know about or didn't have time to put in here. This is one of the imprisonments here. But he was in Rome in verse 11 when he arrived there. Let's see. Okay, after 3 months, we put out to sea in a ship that had wintered in the island. It was an Alexandrian ship with the figurehead of the twin gods Castor and Pollux. We put in at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there, we set sail and arrived at Rhegium. This sounds like a guy who's writing a diary, isn't it? Luke was there. He was with him. Notice, we did this. Luke is there. He's involved. He's with Paul, probably as speaking on his behalf. Speaking on behalf of the defense. And that was allowed during this imprisonment, as we'll see in a minute. The next day, the south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli. There, we found some brothers who invited us to spend a week with them. Now, what kind of an imprisonment allows the prisoner to go spend some time with friends? So these guys knew Paul was not the troublemaker that the Jews had made him out to be. And so then we came to Rome. The brothers there had heard that we were coming and traveled as far as the Forum and Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. So the churches that he wrote to in Rome were established by somebody else, weren't they? Now, one denomination, Christian denomination, claims it was established by Peter. Yet when Paul gets there, no one had the ability to lay hands on or do miracles. He laid his hands on them so they would get that. So there wasn't an apostle there before Paul got there. Be careful if you get in an argument and state that to someone who believes that, because they will fight you to the last drop of your blood. So just, okay. There were very well-established congregations by the time Paul got there. How did they get there? Well, after Stephen was stoned, remember, the Christians went back home and preached the gospel. All their way there and back. Okay. At the sight of these men, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. You never get to the point where you don't need encouragement from other people. We need each other, if for nothing else than for a friendly smile or for a greeting. And even more so for the encouragement that we receive by worshiping together. All right, when we got to Rome, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. And that soldier, they probably stood outside the door, left him alone in his own little house. Again, what prisoners are allowed that kind of freedom? And was it necessarily just to keep him there? Paul wasn't going anywhere. He had gotten direct revelation from Jesus that he was going to talk to Caesar. Well, he's not going to miss that opportunity. He's not going anywhere. So what's the guard for, you think?
To make sure.
Okay, to make sure, but
It was their job.
it had to have a good show to the Jews who brought up the charges. But what were the Jews trying to do to him? Yeah. That imprisonment was a protection. So in that sense, it was a good deal. And that might be what Paul is alluding to in Philippians 1. It's not the kind of imprisonment you think it is, if this one is talking about the same one. All right, 3 days later, he called together the leaders of the Jews. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brothers, although I have done nothing against our people or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me because I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. But when the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had any charge to bring against my people." See, Paul could have been let go, but he said, If Jesus has promised that I can go to Rome, I'll let the Romans take me there. He's under the protection of Rome. Because he knew if the Romans had let him go, it wasn't long before they had him. So he used the protection of his citizenship. "For this reason I have asked to see you and talk with you. It is because of the hope of Israel that I'm bound with this chain." How did they react? Yeah. They replied, "We've not received any letters from Judea concerning you. And none of the brothers who have come from there has reported or said anything bad about you." I kind of wonder how that happened. Because Paul was mouthy and he was everywhere. Evidently, not to the impression that we get about it. At least for anybody who has traveled from the Mideast to Rome on business. No word has come to the churches there. I don't think the Jews ever expected Paul to make it to Rome. It was only then that they realized they had to make a defense, and they trumped up a lawyer and trumped up charges. And that was when he was in Caesarea. I don't think they ever expected him to make it to Rome. Whatever. Okay. But we hear that your views are, we want to hear what your views are. For we know that people everywhere are talking against this sect. That's what they called Christianity. It was a sect of Judaism. That's why Herod didn't want anything to do with it. You got your own Sanhedrin stuff, you take care of it. I don't want anything to do with matters of your religion. Yeah, a sect. All right, well, they arranged to meet Paul on a certain day and came in even larger numbers to the place where he was staying. It got around. They came out from morning till evening. He explained and declared to them the kingdom of God and tried to convince them about Jesus from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Don't you wish we could do that today? Use the law of Moses and the prophets to prove that Jesus was the Christ? Don't you wish we could do that today? We can. But there's too much of a movement anymore within church circles that thinks we don't need the Old Testament anymore. And yet that's what it was all about.
And I think there's something in that verse too. When down there says that some were convinced, that others disbelieved.
Yeah.
So even Paul, I mean, people disbelieve Jesus.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not 100%.
Yeah, and actually the phraseology there, and NIV has it this way, but others would not believe. The actual wording is a frustrated, angry refusal. Not to believe, but that word there is actually, they refused to faith. See, in English, that doesn't make sense because faith is not an action. We usually think that faith means believe, and we have arguments all stated about, faith only. Oh, you get the hairs on the back of people's necks riled up when you talk about faith only. When actually Paul says it is faith only, not works. But our problem is, and this is where Martin Luther had a problem with James, because James says that our faith produces our works. We do these things because of our faith, not in order to prove our faith. Where Paul says in Romans that we're saved by the grace of God, not on the basis of our faith, not by works. The problem is the definition of faith. And it's in most of our translations because publishers want to sell Bibles. Faith does not mean just believe. Faith requires belief in order for it to generate. They call that word pisteuo in the Greek that's translated faith is what they call a pregnant term. There's a lot of things that are born out of it. Faith or belief is just the start. It's like saying your car is a set of tires. Well, there's more to the car than just the tires. But without a set of tires, you're not going anywhere, right? So they are necessary. Belief is necessary for faith, but that's not all that faith is. And so what we're really arguing against is believe only. We're not arguing against faith only. But our belief is to lead to an inner change, a repentance. Our belief then creates a commitment. We come to baptism into Christ on the basis of our faith. Even Peter says, it's not our baptism that saves us, it's our faith that leads us to do that. And it symbolizes a death to sin, burying that old person and rising up a new person. It's a symbolic gesture of what your faith is. It's your faith, not the act, that saves you. And our early restoration leaders had to realize that and clarify it quite a bit. But we lose sight of that too often.
I just said grace.
It's the grace of God, and it's on the basis of our faith. Now, Peter will give a whole bunch of justification for the people who were saved. Noah built an ark. Abraham left his country. And in the same way, baptism now saves us. It's not the act. Noah wasn't necessarily saved by building the ark. It was his faith to realize that after 100 years, it's still going to rain. Something that evidently had never happened before. They didn't have boats back then. And whenever you see one, it didn't have a stern and a keel on it with a little pilot house on the top. The word for ark, the Hebrew word for ark, is a box. If you think of a shoebox, that's what it was. All I had to do was just hold animals and people and float till the water was gone. So it's the faith. And so in this case here, it said they refused to faith. And it's because of their background, their traditions, what they were raised with, what they were always taught. They were not allowing themselves to learn anything new. Paul's understanding scared them. He showed how the law was all to bring them to Christ. You find that in the letter to the Galatians. He found out through the prophets they were all talking about Christ. And even Jesus denounced the Pharisees at one point by saying, you search the scriptures because you think that in them you find what's important for life. But that's the scriptures that talk about me, yet you refuse to come to me. So really, all this is just the record of people coming to faith in God's plan of redemption through Jesus. That's all this is. They're words on a page, unless you put them into practice. Unless you believe them commit to it, and act upon it. But notice, though, it said some were convinced. So even in prison, Paul had very much success. And in the early church, when it first started, Luke records that after Pentecost, every day, many of the priests were becoming saved. Every day. So Paul even had his guards. You can imagine if you had to guard him for a while, you had to listen to it. He had some success among the guards, among the prisoners. Now, they were the ones who really did want to listen and hear. They were looking for something better in life. So he had a lot of success. And then the rest of the book of Acts there, the rest of what Luke records for us, just shows how Paul says, you know what? I did what I needed to do. It's all on you now. And he quoted Isaiah, the prophet. Yeah, you'll be listening, but you won't hear. You'll be talking, but you won't be saying anything. So, and he said, yeah, it's come true. So even there with Isaiah, Old Testament, still talking about Jesus. And when I would teach class, I would have the PowerPoint demonstration here, and something I did myself, and I pat myself on the back for doing it. But everything in Scripture, this whole thing, from Genesis 3 to the end of Revelation, is about one topic, about one person. And that was Jesus. And in the Old Testament, I had an arrow then that would do this sort of thing, pointing to Jesus, because that's what it was all about. So you can't do away with any of it, or you won't understand who Jesus was. And the New Testament letters had an arrow doing this thing, back to Jesus. Just a reminder of what he's done for us. The encouragement to stay with it to the end. And I think the theme verse of the book of Revelation is he who is overcoming to the end. English makes it as a past tense. He who overcomes. Well, no one ever gets to that point, do they? Has anyone ever overcome and they're no longer in need of help? After you die. Right, and that's why those who are overcoming, it's present tense, right up to the point of death, will receive the crown of life. A promise, a guarantee. You don't have to wonder about it. You don't have to wish and hope. That's a promise. So, this is what Paul is looking for. So when he talks about this, he's going to rejoice. Let's see. The two benefits. Everyone around him has heard the gospel. Guards, a lot of people who wouldn't have heard it before. Because I don't know of any of the Christians in the churches of Rome who'd go to the prisons to evangelize. We do that now, which is a good thing. But the other brothers, they're now taking part because Paul's not there to do it. So now they've been encouraged to preach the gospel too. A good example there is the church in Thessalonica. Paul was only with them just a few weeks before a riot caused the brethren to grab him and put him in a boat and send him down to Athens. And yet when he writes the letter, their reputation has been known throughout all the world. Paul's hearing about the good works they're doing. Who did that? There was no apostle there. They didn't really have a preacher. Who did it? Who built that church? Who made it grow? The brothers took it upon themselves to do the work of the church. I mean, you don't have to be a special person. You just need to be willing. And God will work with you and cause you to be an instrument, which is a word he uses here later on in this chapter. All right, he says some preach the gospel out of envy and rivalry. They think they have a better gospel than anybody else. And they try to win people to themselves. And that's really what their goal is to build the numbers and to make a name for themselves and earn a paycheck, get a salary, make a career. Paul says others will do it out of goodwill for the right reasons. The motivation for the latter, the goodwill, is love for Paul And not just for he himself, but for the one that Paul represents, the gospel of Christ. The others do it for former ambition, and how does he feel about that? How does he feel about the others who are preaching it out of envy and rivalry, trying to make trouble for himself?
Rejoice.
Yeah. He says, I don't care. Earlier on in his career, how did he react to it? Yeah, I've got a bunch of scriptures written down here. 1 Corinthians 2, 3, and 4. 2 Corinthians 10, 11, 12. Are all a defense of his apostleship against those super apostles they call themselves. Now he says, you know what? Yeah, forget it. It's not a fight worth fighting.
Yeah, one point, we try to get you on it.
Yeah, when I come there, I'll straighten them out. You're right. That's what he said at one point. Yeah, now he's saying, you know what? Leave them alone. Let them go. Doesn't matter. Christ is being preached.
I'm just sure.
Yeah, and it's like, who was it that went out to fight the enemy? And God told him, no, just stay where you are. This fight isn't yours. Was that David?
I don't think so. Maybe
Might have
one of the later kings.
One of the later kings.
Just go sit there and I'll take care of it.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. This fight belongs to the Lord, it says. And we sing a song about that. The battle belongs to the Lord. It does. We do not have to defend Jesus. You know, we sing the song, Stand Up for Jesus. It's a good song. I know what they're saying, but why do we have to stand up for the conqueror? He's already won. Do we realize he's alive? And he's not going to fail. He's already succeeded. We don't have to defend the church because Jesus promised that nothing would prevail against it. He's promised that it will last throughout eternity. What we need to defend is the faith of each other. And that's what Paul gets into here. And I know, see again, it's a good lesson, a good sermon. There's just a few verses here. But this is what he's going to try to say here. What he's going to pray for is that their faith will not fail. He needs to build their faith because he's not saying that they'll give up the faith. But they could get discouraged. They could step aside. And he does have a few examples of when that happened to him. I think it's in 2 Corinthians when he's reminding the brethren there. He said, I'll stand and I'll fight to the end. He said, but I remember a time when they lowered me in a basket and I ran away. He said, I should have stayed. Because God had promised him all these wonderful things. He's not going to let him die after promising it to him. So we defend each other and we help defend each other's faith. Yeah, but that's why we come together on a weekly basis.
But the fear that he showed at some points showed that he was human.
Oh, sure. You think of a lot of examples of the heroes of the faith, too. David, he ran from Saul. Well, he didn't have to. God had already sent the prophet to anoint him to be king. He's not going to let him die. Maybe one writer, I think it was Charles Swindoll, when he wrote his biography on David, I think I was reading there. Maybe, like him, he's saying, I like to think that he fled from Saul because he didn't want to be the one to kill the one that God had anointed. And it ended up that Saul killed himself. David didn't want to be the one to do that, so he ran away to keep that possibility from happening. That's nice to think about.
Many times that he could have had
Oh, yeah.
opportunity to kill someone.
Yeah, and he let him go just to prove to him, this is not my purpose here. Yeah.
To me, it seems like it would be really hard to have somebody trying to kill you and not to like that.
Not want to stand up for yourself, sure. And then when the young kid came to him and claimed to have killed Saul for him, think he's going to get a reward? How did David reward him? You bothered to kill the Lord's anointed? That's how he felt about it. Abraham, man of faith. Sarah, oh, that's my sister. Twice. Okay. The Bible is not, the heroes of the Bible are not perfect. They just never gave up. And that's what those stories are to teach us. It's not lessons to teach in the children's class. These are real people going through real tests of faith, showing their growth.
Was the church at Rome under persecution because Aquila and Priscilla?
Yeah, the Jews had stirred up reaction that the Christians had burned Rome. There's a conspiracy that Nero burned it so that he could build new buildings, and then blamed it on the Jews and said, it wasn't us, it was the Christians. And so the Christians were expelled. And that's when Paul met them in Corinth. Yeah, they had just been kicked out. Yeah.
In the Romans' minds, didn't they laugh at Jews and Christians all together? They're troublemakers.
Yeah, they considered Christianity a sect of Judaism.
Okay.
There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and now this new sect, which tends to be cannibalistic and quite violent. Everywhere these guys go, there's a riot. Yeah, so, yeah. Was it true? It was actually the Jews who were inciting it all, out of jealousy. And as Luke wrote here in the book of Acts, we just looked at it, their refusal to faith in what the scriptures were really all about. Yeah. All right.
Were they called the Way?
Yeah. The Christians called themselves the Way because Jesus had, and they think it goes back to where Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. There you go. Okay. Funny how the Holy Spirit works out like that, huh? All right. We'll pick up from there next week then.